In these times, it appears obvious that we're facing just not numerous, but also very large problems. When I first heard about these problems, I thought, let's get going, let's solve this, let's do something. But before we figure out how to solve these problems, we have to agree on where we're going. If our current situation is A, then we must find out what this B is before we can get there. Because we want to make sure that we end up at our desired destination and that we're on the right path. There are many examples what happens if you do not have a clear goal, where perhaps the best example would be Egypt, a country which over the last 3 years has seen 3 changes in government with little to no hope of improvement, and where history repeats itself over and over again. Other recent examples would be Ukraine, Bahrain, Libya, and Turkey. And I don't mean that this B, whatever it is, must be our absolute ultimate goal. It's surely only a milestone, but it's what we want, it's the world we dream about. So in more concrete terms, what is the world we dream about? What kind of society do we want to live in? How will the environment be, both in an ecological sense and in a personal sense, both socially and biologically? And I don't mean that we should attribute any special word or term for it or categorize it, but what should it contain and consist of, and how would it work? Should we be hungry or not? Should some be hungry? Should we be sick or healthy? Safe or unsafe? Should we compete, fight, and make war, or should we collaborate? Let's say that we could jump through a portal to another universe, which is just like our own, with the only difference being that on the planet Earth, there's a society that actually works. How is it structured? Well, I'm quite sure that it's a very egalitarian society. Not that everyone is the same, but everyone has the same opportunities and are free from hierarchical structures. This is something that is absolutely necessary for a sustainable society, because when any group of people are exclusively privileged with access to any resource, tensions will arise, and that will eventually lead to some form of conflict. It is therefore in everyone's interest to minimize gaps and work towards preemptive structures in this sense. The society would not only be egalitarian, everyone would also be as healthy and happy as possible. Everyone have to get their needs met. Because I'm very confident that if we're talking about the world we dream about, we all want to have a society where we're not hungry, where we're healthy, safe, and without stress and competition. So what do we humans need? When I say needs, I make a distinction between what we actually need and what we want. Needs are what we have to satisfy because of how evolution has shaped us, biologically and psychologically. Wants are cultural manifestation which, unlike our needs, are subjective and constantly changing. But back to my question. What are our real needs? All people need food, water, clean air, sleep, biophysical and psychosocial protection from the environment, meaning we should feel good both mentally, socially, and physically. We need a low-stress environment, a lack of diseases, nice friends and families, etc. We also need something fun to do, something that inspires us and motivates us to move forward. No one truly wants or can just sit still and really do absolutely nothing. All of the things mentioned are stuff that we humans need, and for a lot of these needs, we would die if we would lack merely one. In a society that works, the members will all work together to ensure that our needs will be satisfied for all humans, because there's to no individual's gain to have sick and suffering people amongst us. In this functional society, the realization of our limitations are also present. The most important limitation is what's called the carrying capacity. It's a term used in biology and ecology, which means the largest numbers of individuals of a species that an environment can sustain indefinitely. This is what ecological sustainability means, to maintain a dynamic equilibrium within the carrying capacity of any environment. This means that even if resources are used and consumed in this society, the level of access to resources are sustainably preserved over time. So it's not that the situation is working just right now, but it will continue to do so even in the future. And I don't mean that there should be quotas on how much food you have access to and so on. But in a functioning society, people realize that if they use more resources than what can be produced, things will turn to the worse eventually. And that has to be avoided. The people of such society must therefore live within not only their local carrying capacity, but also within the entire Earth's carrying capacity. So how do they manage all this? How do they meet the carrying capacity of the Earth? How to streamline their production in order to satisfy everyone's need without exceeding the carrying capacity? To begin with, we can say this. If this world is the world we dream about, if it's not just a fantasy world, but a world we one day can achieve, then this world has roughly as many people as there is on Earth today. So it feels very obvious that they would be technologically advanced. They use technology to streamline their production, distribution and management of resources. And in order to create and develop technology to manage and solve the kinds of problems that arise in a modern technological society, one is fully dependent on the scientific method. It works like this. First, you identify a problem or question that you want to be answered. Often it's a question like, how does this work? For example, how is it that things fall down? Step 2 is to set up a hypothesis, a guess about how you think the phenomenon works. And ideally, you should have read up on the subject first so that you can set up an hypothesis as specific as possible. Maybe someone else has already solved your problem and then you have saved a lot of time. But if your question is unique and no one has found a definitive answer, you can proceed to the next step, trying to disprove your hypothesis. That's the beauty of the scientific method, really. It is humble in that it takes into account that sometimes we're wrong, that we do not know everything. If one were to show through an experiment that his or her hypothesis is correct, then it's easy to think, yeah, I was right, good, and then let it slide. But if you try to disprove your hypothesis and succeed, you have shown that the hypothesis is not entirely correct, and one can then rephrase it or find a new one that applies to the reality as it has been observed in the experiment. And this process of setting up an hypothesis and try to disprove it is then repeated many times. In addition to this, you let other people try the same experiment to see so that they get the same result, to make sure that the phenomenon is independent of the person. And when you finally have repeated and refined your hypothesis so many times that despite extensive and continuing attempts, you can no longer successfully disprove it, you can be very sure that the hypothesis is close to the truth. The hypothesis has then passed and become a scientific theory, which with very high probability accurately describes how the phenomenon works. But you cannot tell if you found the truth about how the words really work, and new information may at any point in time overturn old theories, which has happened many times in history. Despite of this, science is the best method to find out how something will most likely work, and scientific theories can be used to describe how things will behave. I tend to see science as our grammatical rules that we use to be able to communicate with nature. It's not about cold science where scientists without ethical perception callously pours liquid from one test tube to another. It's a way to talk to nature and understand it. Science does not only give us the knowledge to develop new technologies that are fun and interesting, as for example faster cars or better phones, but science gives us through sociology and psychology knowledge of how people behave and interact with each other, which means we have the tools to prevent and solve social problems at both the individual level and on a global societal scale. The development of technology also means that we can automate and streamline our production, which leads to people being freed from tedious and hazardous occupation and can instead devote themselves to things that they are passionate about. But not only that, science is beautiful. I wish I could describe how beautiful it is, but I can't do it any better than the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. So I'll show a short clip where he answers the question, what is the most astounding fact?
What is the most astounding fact you can share with us about the universe?
The most astounding fact.
The most astounding fact.
Is the knowledge that the atoms that comprise life on Earth, the atoms that make up the human body, are traceable to the crucibles that cooked light elements into heavy elements in their core under extreme temperatures and pressures. These stars, the high-mass ones among them, went unstable in their later years. They collapsed and then exploded, scattering their enriched guts across the galaxy. Guts made of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and all the fundamental ingredients of life itself. These ingredients become part of gas clouds that condense, collapse, form the next generation of solar systems, stars with orbiting planets. And those planets now have the ingredients for life itself. So that when I look up at the night sky, and I know that, yes, we are part of this universe, we are in this universe, but perhaps more important than both of those facts is that the universe is in us. When I reflect on that fact, I look up. Many people feel small because they're small and the universe is big, but I feel big because my atoms came from those stars. There's a level of connectivity. That's really what you want in life. You want to feel connected. You want to feel relevant. You want to feel like you're a participant in the goings-on of activities and events around you. That's precisely what we are, just by being alive.
So before an end of this lecture, I would like to do a short summary. We know that the current world situation is not stable or sustainable, but before we can get out of here, we must know where we want to go, what kind of society we want to live in. If we want a society where we feel as satisfied as possible, there are things limiting its structure. It must be socially equitable to prevent conflicts between different groups. This means that we have to satisfy all human needs, not just for equality's sake, but also because no one feels better to have suffering people around them. It's in our interest to help each other. We must also take care of our planet and the environment we depend on. We must live within the Earth's carrying capacity and maintain a dynamic equilibrium. For otherwise, it's not a sustainable society, and if that's the case, it isn't working, right? To do this on a global scale, we must use the best problem-solving method that exists, the scientific method, and use our knowledge and technology to give all people the highest possible standard of living. And it's this body of concept which we in the Zeitgeist movement calls a resource-based economy. That was all. Thank you for listening.